They blocked an old man at a major's funeral, humiliated him in front of the cameras, the mourners, and the world. He stood there, calm but insistent, saying he promised to be there. But no one listened, no one cared, until the Supreme Commander brought the entire ceremony to a dead stop. What was supposed to be a solemn day of honor spiraled into a moment that shook the highest ranks of power. Because something about this man didn't add up. Who was he really? And why did the most powerful man in the military break protocol for him? One moment of cruelty uncovered decades of secrets. Now the truth can't be buried. Not anymore. Before we begin, send a quick wave in the comments. Tell me your city, your country, your vibe. It's amazing how stories like this echo across the world. The morning sun cast long shadows across Arlington National Cemetery's pristine grounds. Row after row of white headstones stretched into the distance, a solemn reminder of sacrifices made. Clay Whitmore stood at the entrance, his weathered hands smoothing down the wrinkles of his thrift store suit. The fabric hung loose on his thin frame, but he held himself with the unmistakable bearing of a soldier. A crowd had gathered for Major Rebecca Sterling's funeral. Men and women in crisp dress uniforms mingled with government officials in expensive suits. The contrast between their polished appearance and Clay's worn clothing couldn't have been more stark. Clay took a step forward, his shoes crunching on the gravel path. Two security officers immediately moved to block his way. Behind them stood Captain Preston Harding, his uniform perfectly pressed, his shoes gleaming in the morning light. "Sir? This is a restricted ceremony," one of the security officers said firmly. Clay's kind eyes showed no anger, only quiet determination. "I understand, but I promised to be here. I gave my word." Captain Harding stepped forward, his face twisted with disdain as he looked Clay up and down. "And who exactly did you make this promise to?" His voice dripped with contempt. "To Rebecca," Clay said softly. "To Major Sterling." A small crowd of onlookers had begun to gather. Several people held up their phones, recording the confrontation. Clay noticed them, but kept his dignity, standing straight despite the public humiliation. "That's absolutely ridiculous," Harding scoffed. "Major Sterling was a decorated officer. She wouldn't associate with—" He paused, letting his eyes rake over Clay's ill-fitting suit again. "Someone like you." Clay's calloused hands clenched slightly at his sides, but his voice remained steady. "Sir, I have every right to be here. I gave my word, and I intend to keep it." More distinguished guests were arriving now. A black limousine pulled up, and several high-ranking military officials stepped out. They paused, watching the scene unfold with mixed expressions of curiosity and disapproval. "This is a private ceremony for distinguished guests only," Harding announced loudly, clearly playing to the growing audience. "We have senators, generals, and diplomatic personnel in attendance. We can't have just anyone walking in off the street." Clay stood his ground, though the pain in his eyes deepened. "I'm not just anyone, Captain. I served with—" "Security!" Harding barked, cutting him off. "Remove this man from the premises. Now!" The two security officers moved forward, placing their hands firmly on Clay's arms. Clay didn't resist, but he didn't retreat either. His military bearing remained evident even as they began to physically push him back. "Please," Clay said, his voice carrying a weight of unspoken history. "I made a promise. She would want me here." Harding stepped closer, lowering his voice to a harsh whisper. "Listen carefully, old man. I don't know what delusions you're operating under, but this is a ceremony honoring a distinguished major who gave her life in service to her country. I will not have you turning it into a spectacle." More phones were recording now. The morning sun caught the silver in Clay's hair as he stood, surrounded by security, but somehow maintaining his dignity. His eyes, filled with a deep pain that went far beyond this moment of humiliation, remained fixed on the ceremony site visible through the gates. "You don't understand," Clay said quietly, speaking more to himself than to Harding. I have to be here. I promised. Remove him, Harding commanded, and make sure he doesn't try to return. The security officers tightened their grip on Clay's arms, beginning to physically force him away from the entrance. Clay allowed himself to be moved, his face a mask of quiet resignation, but his eyes never left the gathering of mourners beyond the gate. As they pushed him back, a distinguished general passing through the gates paused, frowning slightly as if trying to place a familiar face. But before he could speak, Harding stepped forward to greet him, smoothly directing his attention away from the scene. Clay found himself at the perimeter of the cemetery, the security officers releasing him with a warning not to return. He stood there for a long moment, his posture still straight despite the public humiliation he'd just endured. Through the gates, he could see the funeral gathering beginning to move toward the gravesite. The morning sun continued to shine on Arlington's endless rows of white headstones, each one marking a story of service and sacrifice. Clay Whitmore, his promise unkept, stood alone at the edge of this sacred ground, his dignity intact even as his heart broke anew. By nightfall, the video had spread like wildfire across the internet. Homeless man crashes hero's funeral screamed one headline after another. On every major news network, commentators dissected the footage of Clay's confrontation with security, their voices filled with righteous indignation. Clay sat in his modest one-room apartment, the blue light from his small television casting shadows on the bare walls. The newscaster's voice filled the tiny space. In a shocking display of disrespect, an unidentified elderly man attempted to force his way into the funeral of decorated Major Rebecca Sterling at Arlington National Cemetery this morning. The footage played again, Clay in his ill-fitting suit, surrounded by security. The camera angle made him look small and disheveled compared to the uniformed officers. Clay switched off the television, but the damage was already done. His phone buzzed with another anonymous message. "How dare you disrespect our heroes?" Clay placed the phone face down on his scratched coffee table, next to a stack of unopened bills and a single framed photograph, its glass cracked with age. Earlier that day, walking home from the cemetery, people had pointed and whispered. A group of teenagers had followed him for 2 blocks, recording him on their phones and shouting insults. Clay had kept walking, his back straight, his eyes forward, just as he'd been trained all those years ago. The local coffee shop, where he usually got his morning coffee, had turned him away. "We don't serve people who disrespect our military," the manager had said, while customers filmed the interaction on their phones. Across town, in her office at Fort Belvoir, Lieutenant Grace Sterling sat at her desk, watching the viral footage for the 20th time. Her mother's final letter lay open beside her computer, the paper worn from repeated handling. Her eyes kept returning to one particular line. "Remember what I told you about the man who saved us all?" Grace minimized the video window and pulled up her mother's service record again. Major Rebecca Sterling's career was exemplary. Decorated combat veteran, trusted commander, hero, until the end. But there were gaps in the record, classified missions that Grace couldn't access even with her security clearance. Her phone buzzed with another message from a colleague. "Can you believe that guy tried to crash your mom's funeral? Total disgrace." Grace's fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to respond, but something held her back. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "There are things about that mission in Bosnia that you need to know, Grace. Things that never made it into the official record." She pulled up the video again, studying the old man's face. There was something in his bearing, in the way he held himself, that didn't match the media's portrayal of a delusional vagrant. Despite his worn clothing, he stood like a soldier. A knock at her office door startled her. "Lieutenant Sterling?" It was her commanding officer. "We've prepared a statement for you to release about this morning's incident. The media's asking for the family's response." Grace took the offered paper, scanning the carefully worded condemnation of the unfortunate disruption to her mother's funeral. Her mother's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, "Not everything is as it appears, Grace. Sometimes the truth wears unexpected faces." "Can I have some time to review this, sir?" she asked. Back in his apartment, Clay stood at his window watching the news van parked outside. Another reporter waited in the lobby of his building, hoping to catch him for an interview. His neighbors had already given several, describing him as quiet and strange. Clay's eyes drifted to the framed photograph on his coffee table. Behind its cracked glass, a group of soldiers stood in desert fatigues, their faces young and determined. He touched the glass gently, his calloused fingers tracing familiar features now lost to time. "I tried, Rebecca," he whispered to the empty room. "I promised I'd be there, and I tried." On her office computer, Grace opened another tab and began a search. Something about the old man's insistence that he'd made a promise nagged at her. Her mother had always said that promises were sacred things, not to be given or taken lightly. The media storm continued to build. Social media exploded with memes and angry posts. News vans circled Clay's neighborhood like vultures. And in two different parts of the city, two people watched the same footage with very different eyes. One bearing the weight of unspoken truth, the other starting to question everything she thought she knew. Captain Preston Harding straightened his already immaculate uniform before striding into the Pentagon's Office of Military Justice. His polished shoes clicked against the marble floor as he approached the desk of Colonel Matthews. "Sir, I'd like to open an official investigation into yesterday's incident at Arlington," Harding said, placing a carefully prepared folder on the colonel's desk. "The disrespect shown to Major Sterling's memory cannot go unpunished." The colonel leafed through the documents. "A civilian disrupting a military funeral? That's usually a local police matter, Captain." Harding leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Sir, this goes beyond simple trespassing. This individual attempted to insert himself into a highly decorated officer's funeral. The media coverage alone has damaged the Army's reputation. And with the Secretary of Defense in attendance?" He let the implications hang in the air. The colonel nodded slowly. "Very well, Captain. You have authorization to proceed. Keep me updated on your findings." Harding allowed himself a small smile as he left the office. This was exactly the kind of high-profile case that could fast-track his promotion to major. Meanwhile, in her mother's house, Lieutenant Grace Sterling moved methodically through rooms that still held Rebecca's presence. She had taken a few personal days to sort through her mother's belongings, but her real mission was to find answers about the mysterious old man from the funeral. The house was a testament to Major Sterling's military career. Medals displayed in cases, photographs of deployment ceremonies, commendations framed on walls. But Grace was looking for something else, something personal, that might explain her mother's cryptic words. In the study, Grace noticed something odd about the antique desk her mother had always treasured. The wooden panels didn't quite line up on one side. Her fingers found a hidden catch, and a small compartment popped open. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. Grace's hands trembled as she opened it. The first entry was dated 15 years ago, during her mother's deployment to Bosnia. "Operation Silent Shield begins tomorrow," the neat handwriting read. "Staff Sergeant Whitmore leads the advance team. God help us all if this goes wrong." Grace's breath caught. She flipped through more pages, finding scattered references that made her pulse quicken. Whitmore did it. He actually did it. The cost was too high, but he saved every one of us. How do you repay a debt like that? Another entry, dated months later. "They say he survived, but the injuries, the memory loss, they're keeping him in a classified facility. It's better this way, they say. Better for everyone if this stays buried." But how do I tell his daughter? Grace's hands shook as she read those words again. His daughter? She had never known her father. Her mother had always said he died in combat before she was born. Across town, Harding sat at his desk, building his case against Clay. He had already compiled security footage, witness statements, and background checks. The old man's history was surprisingly blank before 10 years ago, a red flag that Harding intended to exploit. His phone rang. "Sir, we've tracked down his current address and employment history," his assistant reported. "He works as a night janitor at a local high school, lives alone in a one-room apartment. No family, no military record we can find. Perfect, Harding said. Draft charges for criminal trespass, disturbing the peace, and disrespecting military honor. I want this wrapped up quickly and publicly. Back in her mother's study, Grace found more recent entries in the journal. Saw Clayton today. He was cleaning floors at the VA hospital. He looked right through me. No recognition at all. The doctors warned us this might be permanent. The debt grows heavier each year. The final entry was dated just weeks before her mother's death. Time is running out. Grace needs to know the truth about Silent Shield, about Clayton, about everything. But how do I even begin to tell her? The promises we made? Some debts can never be repaid. Grace closed the journal, her mind racing. She opened her laptop and typed Operation Silent Shield into the military database. Access denied flashed across her screen. She tried another search. Staff Sergeant Clayton Whitmore. Again, access denied. Her phone buzzed with a message from a colleague. Harding's pushing hard on this funeral crasher case. They're talking serious charges. Grace looked at the journal in her hands, then at the photo on her mother's desk. Major Rebecca Sterling receiving her Silver Star. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Sometimes the most important battles are fought far from any battlefield. She took a deep breath and made a decision. If Harding was investigating the old man from the funeral, she needed to move quickly. Her mother's journal held the truth about Operation Silent Shield, about this Staff Sergeant Whitmore, and somehow about her own history. But she would have to be careful. Harding was ambitious and ruthless, and he clearly saw this case as a path to promotion. Grace slipped the journal into her bag, her mind already forming a plan. Her mother had taught her that truth and justice didn't always travel the same path. Sometimes you had to choose which one to follow. Grace sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of official military documents. Her mother's journal lay open beside her laptop, its weathered pages a stark contrast to the crisp government reports on her screen. The official records were clear. 23 years ago, then Lieutenant Rebecca Sterling had single-handedly saved her unit after an ambush in Bosnia, earning her first Bronze Star and rapid promotion. But her mother's journal told a different story. Grace read the entry again, dated April 15th, 1999. The ambush came out of nowhere. We were pinned down, no escape route. I was sure we were all going to die. Then Clay. What he did that night? The official report is a lie. They made us all swear to keep silent, said it was a matter of national security. But how do you bury a truth that big? Grace rubbed her tired eyes. She had been digging through records for hours, looking for any trace of Staff Sergeant Clayton Whitmore. It was like he had never existed. Every file that might have contained his name was either heavily redacted or classified beyond her security clearance. There was one person who might know the truth. Sergeant Major Tom Briggs had served with her mother in Bosnia. He still worked at Fort Belvoir, training new recruits. Grace had met him at military functions over the years, always noting how he seemed to watch her mother with a mixture of respect and guilt. The next morning, Grace found Briggs at the base training grounds, supervising morning drills. His face was weathered, his hands scarred from decades of service. When he saw her approaching, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, and maybe fear. "Lieutenant Sterling," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I'm sorry about your mother. She was a fine officer." "Thank you, Sergeant Major," Grace replied. "I need to talk to you about Bosnia, about what really happened that night." Briggs's face went pale. He dismissed the recruits with a sharp command, then led Grace to his office. The small room was Spartanly furnished, with only a desk, 2 chairs, and a wall of military citations. He closed the door carefully before speaking. "You shouldn't be asking about that mission, Lieutenant. It's still classified." Grace placed her mother's journal on his desk. "My mother left this behind. I know the official story isn't true. I know someone else saved the unit that night. Someone whose name was erased from the records." Briggs's hands trembled slightly as he touched the journal. "Your mother kept a diary?" she knew better than that. She knew someone needed to know the truth, Grace pressed. The official report says she was the only one who made it to the ridge to call in the evacuation, but that's not what happened, is it? Briggs sank into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 50 years. I swore an oath, Lieutenant. We all did. What happened that night? It's better left in the past. Better for whom? Grace demanded. The man who saved you all is out there somewhere. I saw him at my mother's funeral, but security threw him out like a vagrant. How is that better? Briggs closed his eyes, his face twisted with what looked like physical pain. I still have nightmares about that night. The ambush. We were surrounded. Your mother was hit early, couldn't move. We were running out of ammunition. The extraction point was half a mile away across open ground. It was suicide to try for it. He paused, wrestling with memories he'd clearly tried to bury. Someone had to make it to that ridge. Someone had to call in our position. But the enemy had heavy weapons trained on every escape route. What happened? Grace whispered. Briggs's eyes snapped open, haunted. I can't tell you details, but I can tell you this. Your mother didn't save us that night. The man who did, what he sacrificed, they classified it all, said it never happened, gave your mother the credit because she was conscious when the choppers arrived. The rest of us were ordered to forget. But you didn't forget? Grace said softly. How could I? Briggs's voice cracked. I see it every night in my dreams. The explosion. The screams. One man running straight into enemy fire so the rest of us could live. He looked at Grace with tears in his eyes. I'm sorry, Lieutenant. That's all I can say. I made promises. Grace understood then why her mother had left the journal for her to find. The truth had been eating away at these men for 23 years, trapped behind walls of classified documents and sworn statements. The man at the funeral, she said. The one in the old suit? Was that him? Briggs stood up abruptly, turning to face the wall of citations. I can't help you anymore, Lieutenant. Please, don't ask me questions I'm not allowed to answer. But his reaction told Grace everything she needed to know. She had been right. There was more to Clay Whitmore than a homeless man crashing a military funeral. Much more. Grace watched Briggs wrestle with his conscience, his weathered hands gripping the edge of his desk. After what felt like an eternity, he walked to his filing cabinet, unlocked the bottom drawer, and pulled out a worn manila envelope. What I'm about to show you? He said, his voice barely above a whisper. This stays between us. These are my personal copies. They don't exist officially anymore. He spread several photographs across the desk. They showed a younger Special Forces team, their faces dirty but smiling. In the center stood a tall, muscular man with kind eyes that Grace immediately recognized. Staff Sergeant Clayton Whitmore, Briggs said, pointing to the familiar face. Clay was the best operator I ever knew. When everything went sideways that night in Bosnia, he's the one who saved us all, including your mother. Grace picked up the photo, studying the younger version of the man she'd seen humiliated at her mother's funeral. Tell me what happened, please. I need to know. Briggs sank back into his chair, his eyes distant. The mission was compromised from the start. Someone had leaked our position to the local militia. We were supposed to be extracting a high-value intelligence asset, but instead, we walked into a trap. He pulled out a tactical map, its creases deep from years of folding and unfolding. Your mother, Lieutenant Sterling then, was hit in the first volley. Not critical, but she couldn't walk. We were pinned down here, he pointed to a valley on the map, with hostile forces on 3 sides. The only extraction point was on this ridge, half a mile away. Grace leaned forward, absorbing every detail. The official report says my mother made it to the ridge. No. Briggs shook his head firmly. Clay did. We were running low on ammunition, radio was damaged, and that ridge was the only place with clear transmission to call in support. Someone had to make it up there or we were all dead. His voice grew hoarse. Clay? He looked at your mother, looked at all of us, and made a decision. He gathered every spare magazine we had, handed his medical supplies to our medic, and said, "Keep her alive. I'm going to clear you a path." Briggs wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Before any of us could stop him, he was moving. Drew their fire away from our position, used himself as bait to pull their attention while we started moving the wounded. He fought his way up that ridge like a man possessed. Grace could barely breathe. How did he survive? We didn't think he had, Briggs replied. He made it to the ridge, called in our coordinates for emergency extraction. But then, he paused, swallowing hard. Then he called in an airstrike on his own position. What? Grace whispered. The enemy forces were closing in. If they took the ridge, they'd have a clear shot at our helicopters. Clay knew that. So he called in danger close artillery support right on top of himself. Gave the rest of us the cover we needed to get your mother and the others to the secondary extraction point. Briggs pulled out another document, a battlefield citation, heavily redacted. The explosion? We thought nobody could have survived it. The brass classified everything, buried it all. Easier to list him as killed in action than explain how one Special Forces operator held off an entire militia. They gave your mother the credit because she was the ranking officer when the rescue birds arrived. Grace felt tears running down her cheeks. But he did survive. Somehow. Briggs nodded. I found out years later he'd been recovered by a classified medical unit. Severe injuries, traumatic amnesia. They kept him in a secure facility for years. By the time he recovered enough to remember who he was, the official story was set in stone. All this time, Grace said, her voice shaking, he's been alive, carrying this burden alone. And we just watched while they threw him out of my mother's funeral like he was nothing. Your mother never forgot what he did, Briggs said softly. Those journal entries, she carried that guilt every day, knowing she was celebrated as a hero while Clay lost everything. Grace gathered the photos and documents with trembling hands. He didn't lose everything, she said firmly. He kept his honor, his dignity. Even when they humiliated him at the funeral, he just stood there, calm and certain, because he knew he belonged there. He knew the truth. Grace, Briggs said, using her first name for the first time. What are you going to do? She stood straight, her mother's determination evident in her bearing. I'm going to make this right. Clay Whitmore didn't just save my mother's life that night, he saved her entire unit. He deserves to be recognized for what he did, not treated like a trespasser at her funeral. Briggs looked at her with a mixture of pride and concern. Be careful. There are people who've worked very hard to keep this story buried. Grace tucked the envelope of evidence into her jacket. They didn't count on my mother leaving behind a daughter who knows how to find the truth, or a hero who remembers his promise to be there for her, no matter what. Captain Preston Harding stared at his computer screen, frustration evident in the tight set of his jaw. Clay Whitmore's service record glowed back at him, more black bars than text. Every significant detail had been redacted, leaving only the most basic information visible. This doesn't make sense, he muttered, straightening his already perfect tie. A simple vagrant shouldn't have classified records. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd been saving for special occasions. Derek, I need that favor you owe me. I want everything you can find on a Clayton Whitmore, former staff sergeant. Yes, the one from the funeral incident. While waiting for his contact to deliver, Harding began crafting his narrative. He opened a new document and started typing. Subject displays signs of delusional behavior, attempting to insert himself into classified military operations. His phone buzzed. The message from his contact was brief. Lots of walls around this one. Someone important wants this buried. Harding smiled. Important people meant important secrets, and important secrets meant career opportunities. He straightened the brass nameplate on his desk and made another call. Colonel Matthews? Sir, I've uncovered a potential security breach. We have an individual claiming military service, attempting to access restricted ceremonies. Yes, sir, the funeral incident. I believe he may be attempting to gather classified information. The lie rolled smoothly off his tongue. Harding had learned long ago that the truth was flexible, especially when it served his ambitions. Across town, Grace Sterling and Tom Briggs sat in a small diner, spreading documents across the Formica table. Their coffee grew cold as they pieced together Clay's past. Harding's pushing hard, Briggs said, sliding a document toward Grace. He's been interviewing everyone who was at the funeral, twisting their statements to make Clay look unstable. Grace picked up the paper, her hands trembling with anger. He's painting Clay as some kind of deranged imposter. These witness statements, they're nothing like what actually happened. Harding's good at this, Briggs replied, his voice heavy with disgust. He takes a grain of truth and builds a mountain of lies around it. Look at how he's using Clay's memory gaps from his injuries to suggest he's fabricating his entire military service. Grace pulled out her mother's journal, now filled with sticky notes and highlighter marks. We have the truth right here, Mom's accounts, your testimony, the original mission reports, which are all classified, Briggs interrupted. Harding knows that. He's counting on us not being able to use any of it officially. Back in his office, Harding met with a young sergeant who had been present at the funeral. The man shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Harding loomed over him. Let me be clear, Harding said, his voice silky smooth. Your original statement about Whitmore being calm and dignified doesn't help maintain military order. Perhaps you'd like to revise your observations? Consider how this might affect your upcoming promotion review. The sergeant swallowed hard. Now that you mention it, sir, he did seem agitated, possibly unstable. That's better, Harding smiled, sliding a revised statement across the desk. Sign here. As evening fell, Grace burst into Briggs's office, her face flushed with urgency. Harding's escalating things. He's filed a formal security risk assessment on Clay. They could arrest him. Briggs looked up from his computer, his expression grim. It's worse than that. I just got word from a friend in records. Harding's been accessing classified files about Operation Silent Shield. The Bosnia mission? Grace felt her stomach drop. He's not just trying to discredit Clay anymore, Briggs said. He's looking for something specific. Something worth destroying a man's life over. Grace sank into a chair. We need to warn Clay. Harding's not just some bureaucrat with a grudge. He's actively dangerous. Agreed, Briggs nodded, reaching for his phone. But we need to be careful. One wrong move, and Harding will use it to prove his case about Clay being a threat. In his apartment, Harding sat surrounded by papers, a glass of expensive scotch in his hand. On his screen was an email from 23 years ago, recovered from a deeply buried archive. Operation Silent Shield compromised, asset location leaked, source of breach unknown. He smiled as he typed a new report. Subject Whitmore demonstrates concerning knowledge of classified operations. Recommend immediate detention for national security evaluation. Harding raised his glass in a mock toast. Nothing personal, old man, he murmured. But there are some secrets that need to stay buried, and some heroes who need to stay forgotten. The next morning, Grace stared at the growing file of evidence they'd gathered to support Clay. Her mother's journal entries, Briggs's testimony, fragments of mission reports, all pointing to the truth, but all frustratingly difficult to use against Harding's official investigation. He's not just trying to discredit Clay, she said to Briggs as they reviewed their options. He's trying to erase him completely, make it impossible for anyone to believe the truth. Briggs nodded grimly. And if we don't move fast, he might succeed. Harding's got the power of official channels behind him, and he's not afraid to use it. Then we need to move faster, Grace declared, gathering their evidence. Because Clay's not just fighting for his reputation anymore, he's fighting for his freedom. The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when 3 black SUVs pulled up outside Clay Whitmore's apartment building. Federal agents in tactical gear emerged silently, their movements practiced and precise. Leading them was Captain Preston Harding, his dress uniform pristine, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Grace Sterling watched from her parked car across the street, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She had hoped to warn Clay, but she was too late. Her heart pounded as she watched the agents approach the building's worn entrance. Inside his one-room apartment, Clay sat at his small kitchen table, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. The room was spotless but sparse, a narrow bed with military corners, a threadbare armchair, and a small dresser were his only furniture. The morning light filtered through thin curtains, casting shadows on the bare walls. The pounding on his door echoed like thunder. "Federal agents, open up!" Clay set down his coffee cup with steady hands. He stood slowly, straightened his worn button-down shirt, and walked to the door with the same quiet dignity he'd shown at the funeral. When he opened it, he faced a wall of tactical gear and drawn weapons. "Clayton Whitmore," Harding announced, stepping forward with obvious satisfaction. "You're under arrest for impersonating a military veteran and disturbing a military ceremony." Clay's expression remained calm. "I understand," he said softly, offering his wrists to the agents. As they cuffed him, Grace slipped into the building and watched from the stairwell, fighting back tears. The apartment door stood open, revealing Clay's humble life to all the intruders. One agent began searching the small space while another read Clay his rights. In the dresser drawer, beneath carefully folded clothes, they found a wooden box. The agent opened it, revealing a collection of medals Clay had never displayed. A Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and others, their surfaces dulled with age, but well preserved. "Sir," the agent called to Harding, holding up the box. "These appear to be authentic military decorations." Harding's face darkened. "Bag them as evidence, probably stolen or counterfeit." In another drawer, they discovered a manila envelope containing old photographs. The images were faded but clear. Younger versions of Clay in military uniform, standing with his unit. Some faces were familiar to Grace, her mother, Sergeant Major Briggs. Others she'd seen in official photos. Her throat tightened as she recognized her mother's handwriting on the back of one photo. "Silent Shield Team, the bravest men I've ever known." "Those are private?" Clay said quietly, watching as the agents bagged his precious memories as evidence. "Private?" Harding scoffed. "These are likely classified materials in the possession of an imposter. Another charge to add to the list." Grace wanted to scream out the truth, to stop this injustice, but she knew it would only make things worse. She watched as Clay stood perfectly straight, his bearing unmistakably military despite his age and humble clothes. Even in handcuffs, he carried himself with honor. The agents led Clay toward the door. He paused for a moment, looking back at his small apartment. His eyes fell on a single framed photo on the nightstand, the only decoration he'd allowed himself. In it, a much younger Major Rebecca Sterling stood beside him, both in combat gear, sharing a rare smile in what looked like a forward operating base. "The photo stays," Harding commanded when one agent reached for it. "We'll get a warrant to collect additional evidence later." As they led Clay down the stairs, Grace pressed herself into the shadows, her heart breaking. Clay's eyes met hers briefly as he passed. There was no anger in his gaze, no bitterness, only a quiet acceptance that made the situation even more tragic. Outside, neighbors had gathered to watch the spectacle. Clay walked steadily between the agents, head held high despite the whispers and pointing. One elderly woman crossed herself and muttered, "I knew he was trouble." Too quiet, that one. Grace watched as they loaded Clay into one of the SUVs. Harding stood supervising, clearly enjoying his moment of triumph. The morning sun glinted off his polished captain's bars as he spoke into his phone. "Yes, sir. Suspect is in custody. The threat has been contained." As the vehicles pulled away, Grace remained rooted to her spot, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. The system her mother had served so proudly, the one she herself had sworn to uphold, was being used to destroy an honorable man. The weight of the injustice pressed down on her chest until she could barely breathe. Through her tears, she looked up at Clay's apartment window. The morning sun caught the single-framed photo still sitting on his nightstand. Her mother and Clay, brothers in arms, preserving a moment of truth that now seemed in danger of being lost forever. In that moment, watching the SUVs disappear around the corner, Grace understood just how dangerous their situation had become. This wasn't just about clearing Clay's name anymore. It was about saving him from a system that had turned against one of its own heroes. Grace sat cross-legged on her living room floor, surrounded by her mother's journals and medical records. Her hands trembled as she opened the oldest journal, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. The apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of her laptop, displaying Clay's declassified military records on the screen. Her mother's elegant handwriting filled the pages, telling a story that made Grace's heart race. She read about early morning coffees shared in the mess hall, quiet conversations during night watch, and stolen moments between missions. Rebecca Sterling had written about Clay Whitmore with a tenderness Grace had never seen in her always professional mother. Clay makes me laugh even when everything around us is falling apart, one entry read. He has this way of finding hope in the darkest places. Today he told me about the farm where he grew up, and for a moment I could see myself there with him. After all this is over. Grace's breath caught as she turned to an entry dated just days before the ambush. I haven't told Clay about the baby yet. How can I? We're in the middle of a war zone, and this mission is too important. But every time he looks at me with those kind eyes, I want to tell him everything. After we get back, after this is all over, then we'll have time. Tears blurred Grace's vision as the truth crystallized. She was that baby? Clay Whitmore wasn't just her mother's savior, he was her father. Her hands shaking harder now, Grace opened the classified medical records Briggs had helped her obtain. The sterile language told a devastating story. Staff Sergeant Clayton Whitmore had survived the airstrike but suffered severe head trauma and extensive burns. He'd spent years in a classified medical facility, his identity protected due to the mission's sensitive nature. When Clay's memory partially returned, officials told him Rebecca Sterling had died in action. By then, Grace was already 3 years old, being raised by a single mother who believed her child's father had died a hero. Grace reached for her own baby photos, studying her features with new eyes. Her mother's determined jawline, yes, but those kind eyes that everyone commented on, they were Clay's eyes. She'd been looking into her father's eyes that day at the funeral, never knowing the truth. A medical report from 2003 detailed Clay's eventual release into civilian life. Patient exhibits significant permanent memory loss, but has regained basic functions. Recommended for discharge with monitored integration into civilian population. Patient continues to express desire to honor his promise to attend Major Sterling's funeral should the occasion arise. Even with his memories fractured, Clay had held on to that promise for decades. Grace thought of him sitting in his sparse apartment all these years, quietly carrying the weight of his sacrifice while the world moved on without him. She found her mother's final journal, the one she'd kept during her last deployment. The entries were shorter, written with a shaking hand as illness took its toll. I should have told Grace about her father years ago, one entry read. But how do you tell your daughter that her father made the ultimate sacrifice, that he gave up everything, including us, to save not just me, but our entire unit? The official story was easier, cleaner. Now I'm running out of time and the truth weighs so heavy. Grace picked up her phone, looking at the viral video of Clay being blocked from the funeral. The comments were cruel, mocking what they saw as a deluded old man. But Grace saw something different now. She saw a father who didn't even know he had a daughter, trying to honor his promise to the woman he'd loved. Her mother's final journal entry was dated just 3 weeks before her death. "If you're reading this, Grace, I'm so sorry. I should have been braver. Should have told you the truth about Clay. He was the best man I ever knew, and you are so much like him. The same quiet strength, the same unfailing moral compass. The truth about Operation Silent Shield is buried in classified files, but the truth about your father is simple. He loved deeply enough to give up everything for those he cared about. I pray someday you'll understand why I kept this secret, and that somehow the truth will find its way into the light." Grace closed the journal, her mother's words echoing in her mind. The man sitting in a jail cell wasn't just a forgotten hero. He was her father, and he was facing criminal charges without even knowing he had a daughter fighting for him. She looked at the time, 11:47 p.m. The night felt heavy with revelation as Grace gathered the journals and records, carefully placing them in her briefcase. Her world had transformed in the space of a few hours, the puzzle pieces of her life rearranging themselves into a new picture that both broke her heart and filled it with purpose. The truth about Clay Whitmore wasn't just about clearing an innocent man's name anymore. It was about reuniting a father and daughter torn apart by war, sacrifice, and secrets. Grace touched the photo of her mother and Clay, tracing their young, hopeful faces with her finger. She had to make this right, not just for Clay, but for all of them. General Marcus Kane stood at the window of his Pentagon office, staring at the Washington Monument in the distance. His phone buzzed again. Another news alert about the Arlington Cemetery imposter. He'd been ignoring these notifications for days, but something made him look this time. The image on his screen froze him in place. An elderly man in an ill-fitting suit, being led away in handcuffs. Those eyes. He knew those eyes. They had haunted his dreams for 23 years. "Dear God," Kane whispered, his coffee cup slipping from his fingers and shattering on the floor. "It's him." His assistant rushed in. "Sir, are you all right?" Kane barely heard her. His mind was back in Bosnia, in the blood and chaos of that night. He had been a young lieutenant then, trapped with his unit in an impossible situation. And then there was Clay, Staff Sergeant Clayton Whitmore, standing in the doorway of their bunker, telling them to run while he held the position. "Get me everything we have on this Arlington Cemetery arrest," Kane ordered, his voice tight with urgency, "and connect me to the FBI field office handling the case." While his staff scrambled to gather information, Kane pulled out his bottom desk drawer. Inside lay a worn leather box he hadn't opened in years. His trembling fingers lifted the lid, revealing a silver star. Not his own, but one he'd accepted on behalf of a man declared killed in action. "I never believed you were dead," Kane murmured, touching the metal. "But they classified everything so deeply, buried it all under Operation Silent Shield. I searched for years." His computer chimed with incoming files. Kane's jaw clenched as he read Captain Preston Harding's falsified reports painting Clay as a delusional imposter. The general's face darkened with each page. "Sir," his assistant appeared in the doorway. "FBI Assistant Director Matthews for you." Kane grabbed his phone. "Jim, this is Kane. You have a man in custody, Clayton Whitmore. I need those charges dropped immediately." "Marcus, you know I can't just..." "That man saved 37 lives in Bosnia, including mine. His records were classified under Operation Silent Shield. I'm initiating an emergency declassification order right now." "There's a problem, sir," Matthews said carefully. "Captain Harding has already processed the charges. He's got congressional oversight involved, claiming this is about protecting the integrity of military honors." Kane's free hand curled into a fist. Harding doesn't know what he's dealing with. That man he's persecuting? The silver star on my desk belongs to him. Everything I've accomplished in my career, every life I've been able to save, it's because Clay Whitmore gave me the chance to live that night. He paused, memories washing over him. "I was 26 years old, Jim, a lieutenant with more ambition than sense. Clay could have taken the last helicopter out, but he stayed behind. Called in airstrikes on his own position to make sure we got away clean. The brass buried it all because the mission was off the books, and Clay paid the price for their secrets. "Sir," his assistant interrupted softly, "Captain Harding is on line 2. He's demanding to speak with you about interfering with his investigation." Kane's expression hardened. "Tell Captain Harding that the Supreme Allied Commander is formally taking over his investigation. And Jim, I want Clay released into my custody within the hour." "Sir, there are procedures." "Then break them." Kane's voice carried the weight of 23 years of guilt and gratitude. "I've spent my entire career trying to live up to the example Clay set that night. He showed me what real leadership means, that sometimes the greatest authority comes from the willingness to sacrifice everything for your people." Kane looked again at the viral video of Clay's arrest, at the quiet dignity in the old soldier's bearing, even in handcuffs. "I've got stars on my shoulders and enough political capital to wage a small war, Jim. And I'm using every bit of it to help the man who gave me the chance to earn them." His computer pinged with another message. Harding was now trying to expedite Clay's transfer to a federal facility. Kane felt a cold anger he hadn't experienced since his combat days. "Get me the Secretary of Defense," he told his assistant, "and then the Joint Chiefs. It's time they learned the truth about Operation Silent Shield." He picked up Clay's silver star, its weight familiar in his palm. "We buried this man's sacrifice once. I won't let it happen again." The wheels of power began turning as Kane activated networks built over decades of service. Every person he contacted owed their life to Clay's actions that night in Bosnia, whether they knew it or not. The general's determination grew with each call, each reminder of the debt they all owed to a man who had asked for nothing in return. Kane looked once more at the Washington Monument standing tall against the darkening sky. Somewhere in a cell, the man who had given him a future was waiting, unaware that his past was finally catching up to him. The general squared his shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of command. "Hold on, Clay," he murmured. "This time we're coming back for you." Captain Preston Harding paced in his dimly lit office, phone pressed to his ear. "It has to be tonight. Kane's already pushing for his release." He listened intently, jaw clenched. "No, you don't understand. If Whitmore talks, everything we've built comes crashing down." On his desk lay a folder marked Operation Silent Shield, classified. Inside were documents that told the real story, not just of Clay's sacrifice, but of the defense contracts worth millions that followed. Contracts built on stolen valor and carefully crafted lies. "Listen to me," Harding hissed into the phone. "Black River Defense made billions selling tactical solutions based on what supposedly happened that night in Bosnia. We can't let some forgotten hero destroy 23 years of profitable mythology." He pulled up the transport schedule on his computer. "The prisoner transfer is happening at 2200 hours. Make it look like an accident." Miles away, Grace Sterling's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from General Kane. "Transport route compromised. Clay in danger, GPS coordinates attached." Her heart pounding, she grabbed her keys and ran for her car. The prison transport van wound through dark country roads, wipers fighting against the steady rain. Clay sat quietly in the back, hands cuffed, watching water streak across the windows. The two guards avoided looking at him, their discomfort evident in their rigid postures. A black SUV appeared in the transport van's mirrors, moving fast. The guard driving squinted through the rain. "We've got company." The SUV rammed them from behind. The van swerved, tires struggling for grip on the wet asphalt. Clay braced himself as another impact sent them spinning. Metal screamed against metal as the van crashed through the guardrail. The world turned upside down as they rolled down the embankment. Clay was thrown against his restraints, pain exploding through his body. The van came to rest on its side, steam hissing from the crushed engine. Clay fought to stay conscious. One guard wasn't moving. The other was calling for help on a crackling radio. Through the spider-webbed windshield, Clay saw the SUV's headlights disappear into the night. Grace's car skidded to a stop at the crash site 20 minutes later. Her headlights illuminated the mangled guardrail and deep tire tracks in the mud. "Dad!" she screamed, scrambling down the wet embankment. The word felt strange on her lips. She'd never said it aloud before. She found Clay still strapped in the overturned van, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. His eyes fluttered open as she reached him. "Grace?" he whispered. You called me Dad." "Stay with me," Grace pleaded, checking his pulse. It was weak but steady. "Help is coming." "You know then," Clay said softly, "about Bosnia, about your mother." "I know everything," Grace fought back tears. "How you saved them all. How they buried the truth." Clay's breathing was labored. "Harding, he works for them. Black River Defense. They built their empire on lies about that night. Couldn't let the real story come out." Grace heard sirens in the distance. She held Clay's hand, feeling its warmth, trying to transfer her strength into him. "Just hold on. Please." Back in his office, Harding was destroying documents when his door burst open. General Kane stood there, flanked by military police. "Preston Harding." Kane's voice was cold steel. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and treason." Harding reached for his desk drawer, but Kane was faster. "The Black River files are already in FBI custody," the general said. "Your friends can't help you anymore." "You don't understand," Harding snarled. "We gave people the story they needed. A clean narrative, no messy loose ends. Whitmore was supposed to stay dead. Everyone was happier that way." "Happier?" Kane stepped closer, his authority filling the room. "You built a fortune on another man's sacrifice. You tried to kill him to protect your lies." "He was nothing," Harding shouted. "A broken soldier who should have stayed forgotten. We took his story and turned it into something useful. The contracts, the weapon systems, all of it built on the legend we created." "The legend you stole," Kane corrected. "Take him." As the MPs led Harding away, Kane's phone rang. It was Grace. "Clay's alive," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "They're taking him to Walter Reed. The doctors say he'll make it." Kane closed his eyes, relief washing over him. "Stay with him. I'll be there soon." He looked at the Washington skyline, where lights still burned in offices of power, offices where more conspirators waited, not yet knowing their time had run out. "One more thing," Grace added. "He knows I'm his daughter. We talked before the ambulance came." "Your mother would be proud," Kane said softly, "of both of you." The general gathered the remaining files on his desk, evidence of a conspiracy that had finally unraveled. Clay Whitmore had survived death twice now, in Bosnia and tonight. This time, Kane swore his hero's welcome would not be denied. Grace's headlights cut through the rain as her car sped along the winding road, General Kane's SUV close behind. Major Tom Briggs sat beside her, his weathered hands gripping the dashboard. "There!" he shouted, pointing to the mangled guardrail. They skidded to a stop, tires spraying mud. Through the downpour, they could see the transport van lying on its side at the bottom of the embankment. But something was wrong. A familiar figure stood near the wreck, his service weapon drawn. "Harding," Grace whispered, her blood running cold. The captain had his gun trained on the van's rear doors. One guard lay motionless in the mud, while the other sat dazed against a tree. Clay was still inside, trapped. "Stay here," Briggs ordered, but Grace was already moving. She drew her sidearm and started down the slope, her boots sliding in the wet grass. "That's far enough, Lieutenant Sterling," Harding called out, his voice eerily calm. "This doesn't concern you." "It became my concern when you tried to murder an innocent man," Grace replied, keeping her weapon steady. Harding laughed, a hollow sound that mixed with the falling rain. "Innocent? Do you know how many millions we made selling the sanitized version of Bosnia? The weapons systems, the tactical protocols, all based on our carefully crafted story. He kicked the van's door. This man's inconvenient survival threatens everything. Inside the van, Clay stirred. Despite his injuries, his military training kicked in as he assessed the situation. He could hear Grace's voice, so familiar now that he knew why it tugged at his heart. Black River Defense paid us well to keep the real story buried, Harding continued. A messy truth about heroic sacrifice doesn't sell as well as a clean narrative about superior technology and tactical innovation. He aimed his gun at the van's fuel tank. Sometimes legends need to stay dead. Drop your weapon! Kane's voice boomed from the top of the embankment. Military police were spreading out behind him, their rifles trained on Harding. But Harding was beyond reason. You don't understand. We built an empire on this lie, billions in contracts, all because we controlled the story. His finger tightened on the trigger. Grace saw his intention and lunged forward. No! The gun roared in the rain, but instead of the van exploding, Grace felt herself being tackled to the ground. Clay had somehow broken free of the wreck and thrown himself between her and Harding. They rolled in the mud as more shots rang out. Stay down, Clay ordered, shielding her with his body despite his injuries. His protective instinct was overwhelming, even though he didn't yet know she was his daughter. Kane's men opened fire. Harding spun and fell, his weapon flying from his hand. Within seconds, MPs swarmed down the slope, securing the scene. Clay? Grace touched his shoulder. He was trembling from pain and exhaustion, but his grip on her remained firm, protective. Couldn't let him hurt you, Clay mumbled. Don't know why, but had to protect you. Tears mixed with rain on Grace's face. Even without knowing their connection, his paternal instincts had proven stronger than his injuries. Kane reached them as medics rushed down the embankment. Get them both to Walter Reed now, he ordered. Then he turned to Harding, who lay groaning in the mud, clutching a shoulder wound. Preston Harding, you're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and treason against the United States. Briggs helped the medics load Clay onto a stretcher. The whole operation, he said to Kane, all those years of lies, is over, Kane finished. Black River's board of directors is being arrested as we speak. 23 years of stolen valor and profiteering, finally exposed. Grace refused to leave Clay's side as they carried him up the slope. His hand found hers, squeezing weakly. Thank you, she whispered. For what? Clay asked, his voice rough with pain. For being exactly the hero my mother always said you were. Grace watched his eyes widen with understanding, but the medics were already loading him into the ambulance. Kane put his hand on Grace's shoulder as they watched the ambulance pull away, its sirens cutting through the rain. He still doesn't know he's your father, the general said softly. No, Grace replied, but he proved it anyway. She looked at Harding being led away in handcuffs. He chose to protect me without even knowing why. Thunder rolled across the sky as more emergency vehicles arrived. The rain began to ease, washing away the mud and blood of the night's violence. But it couldn't wash away the truth. Not anymore. 3 weeks after the crash, Arlington National Cemetery looked different in the morning sunlight. Gone was the rain and controversy of the first ceremony. Today, the pristine rows of white headstones gleamed under a cloudless sky as hundreds gathered for Major Rebecca Sterling's proper funeral. This time, Clay Whitmore sat in the front row, his military dress uniform crisp and perfectly fitted. Though still recovering from his injuries, he sat straight-backed with quiet dignity. Grace sat beside him, their shoulders touching, providing silent support. General Kane stepped to the podium, his 4 stars catching the sunlight. Today, we gather not only to honor Major Rebecca Sterling, but to correct a grave injustice. For 23 years, the truth about one of our greatest heroes was hidden behind classified documents and corporate greed. He gestured to Clay. Staff Sergeant Clayton Whitmore's service record has finally been declassified. His actions in Bosnia didn't just save Major Sterling's unit, they changed the course of modern warfare. Today we recognize him as one of the most decorated soldiers in United States military history. Kane detailed the full scope of Clay's heroism: 15 classified operations, 37 confirmed saves, and the night in Bosnia when he called in airstrikes on his own position to protect his fellow soldiers. The audience sat in stunned silence as the truth emerged. The medals we present today, Kane continued, include the Distinguished Service Cross, 3 Silver Stars, and the Defense Distinguished Service Medal. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. But perhaps most importantly, we present the Medal of Honor, awarded for conspicuous gallantry above and beyond the call of duty. Clay rose slowly, his recent injuries still evident in his careful movements. Grace helped steady him as he walked to the podium. Kane turned to face him, and in a moment that brought tears to many eyes, rendered a perfect salute. "Staff Sergeant Whitmore," Kane declared, his voice carrying across the cemetery, "you are the guardian who saved us all. On behalf of a grateful nation, we thank you." Clay returned the salute, his weathered face showing both pride and humility. As Kane pinned the Medal of Honor to his chest, Clay's eyes found Grace in the front row. She was crying freely now, seeing her father finally receive the recognition he deserved. After the ceremony, mourners gathered to pay their respects at Rebecca's grave. Clay and Grace stood together, their matching eyes fixed on the headstone. "She would have loved this," Grace said softly. "Seeing you honored, seeing us together." Clay nodded, touching the fresh medals on his chest. "I wish I'd known about you sooner. All those years we lost." "We have time now," Grace assured him, taking his hand. "And Mom left me her journal. She wrote about you almost every day, telling me who my father really was, even if she couldn't say it out loud." Later that week, Clay moved into a small house near Grace's base. His recovery would take time, but having his daughter nearby gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. They spent evenings on his back porch, where Clay began teaching Grace the survival skills that had once saved her mother's unit. "Always check your surroundings first," Clay instructed, showing her how to read the terrain. "Your mother picked this up faster than anyone I'd ever trained." Grace smiled, recognizing her mother's stories coming to life through Clay's teachings. She wrote about how you taught her to navigate by stars, how you could read weather patterns in the wind. They worked together, father and daughter, their bond growing stronger with each lesson. Clay's tactical knowledge merged with Grace's modern military training, creating something new and powerful between them. When Grace struggled with a particular technique, Clay's patience never wavered. "You have your mother's determination," he would say, pride evident in his voice, "and maybe a little of my stubbornness too." One evening, as they practiced field medicine techniques, Grace asked about the night in Bosnia. Clay was quiet for a long moment, his hands steady as he demonstrated proper bandaging. "I didn't know your mother was pregnant," he said finally, "but something told me I had to make sure she survived that night. Maybe some part of me sensed you were there too." Grace helped him wrap the practice bandage. "And now you're teaching me how to survive." "Full circle," Clay agreed, his eyes crinkling with emotion. "Your mother would say that's how the best stories end." They continued their training sessions, each one bringing them closer together. Clay's instruction went beyond mere survival skills. He taught Grace about honor, sacrifice, and the true meaning of service. Their shared courage and dedication formed the foundation of their relationship, building something stronger than the years of separation could erase. As summer faded into fall, Clay watched his daughter master the skills that had once saved her mother's unit. In Grace's determined focus, he saw echoes of both Rebecca's strength and his own resilience. Their bond, forged through shared courage and sacrifice, had become something neither time nor distance could break. The truth had finally come to light. Justice had been served, and in the end, a father and daughter found their way back to each other, their connection stronger for having been tested by fire and time. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.